They were only teenagers, but what they faced would break most adults. Bullied, ignored, pushed to the edge. Yet they didn't back down. If you've ever felt invisible, unheard, or powerless in a place that should have protected you, this story will hit home. And the ending? You won't see it coming. Stay with us, because what happened next is a lesson we all need to hear. Like this video, subscribe now, and let's dive into a story that proves resilience always rises. Lisa and Mia Johnson had always been close. As identical twins, they did everything together, from sharing clothes and secrets to dreaming about their futures. When their family moved to a new city and enrolled them at Maplewood Academy, it felt like a fresh start. But from the moment they walked through the front gates, they sensed they were different. Not because of their grades, their personalities, or how they spoke, but because of something they had no control over: the color of their skin. Maplewood Academy was a prestigious private school, known for its ivy-covered buildings and academic excellence. It also had a student body that was overwhelmingly white. Lisa and Mia, two bright black girls raised with love and pride, stood out in every hallway, classroom, and cafeteria line. And while they were used to being noticed for their talents and ideas, this kind of attention felt different. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't curiosity. It was something colder, heavier, a quiet but constant judgment in the way eyes followed them, in how conversations stopped when they walked by. Their parents, especially their father Samuel, had prepared them for this. He had told them about the world, how not everyone would see their worth, and how some would only see their skin before anything else. He reminded them to walk tall, to stay kind, and to never forget who they were. Lisa and Mia held on to that advice like armor. Still, no amount of preparation could make those first few days at Maplewood easier. In the first week alone, they found themselves isolated. Teachers didn't seem to learn their names as quickly as the others. Classmates avoided sitting near them. When they raised their hands to answer questions, they were often overlooked. Even the most basic attempts at making friends, simple hellos or small talk during lunch, were met with awkward silences or polite smiles that didn't go beyond the surface. There was no outright name-calling or shouting, but the exclusion was loud in its own way. The silence was sharp. What hurt the most wasn't just the stares or the whispers. It was the feeling of being invisible and exposed at the same time. It was knowing they had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. It was the weight of having to smile through the discomfort, of pretending not to notice when classmates looked past them in group projects or skipped them in hallway greetings. Lisa and Mia didn't want pity. They wanted fairness. A chance. A seat at the table without having to beg for it. At night, when the house was quiet, they talked to each other in whispers. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just sat in silence, finding comfort in the fact that they weren't alone. No matter how tough the day had been, they had each other. That bond became their lifeline. It gave them the strength to show up each morning, even when their stomachs turned at the thought of walking through the front doors. The beginning at Maplewood wasn't just difficult. It was a crash course in how deeply rooted bias could feel in the day-to-day lives of kids just trying to belong. Lisa and Mia hadn't expected applause or instant friendships, but they also hadn't expected the coldness. And while they didn't know how things would unfold in the weeks to come, one thing was already clear: this journey wasn't going to be easy. But it was one they would walk together, head high, heart steady, and with more strength than anyone around them could yet understand. At first, Lisa and Mia thought maybe the distance from their classmates was just discomfort or unfamiliarity. Maybe people just didn't know how to connect with someone new. But it didn't take long to realize that for a few students, it wasn't just hesitation. It was hostility. And at the center of that hostility was Ethan Carter. Ethan wasn't just another student at Maplewood. He was the kind of boy everyone seemed to orbit around. Tall, confident, the son of a well-known businessman in town. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had never really been told no. He had a group of friends who followed him everywhere, laughing at all his jokes, mimicking his attitude. To most of the teachers, he was charming and outspoken. But to Lisa and Mia, he quickly became a nightmare. It started with little things. The offhand comments as they walked by. The way Ethan would smirk when they spoke in class, then roll his eyes and whisper something to the person next to him. His group started doing it too, snickering when the girls raised their hands, sighing loudly if they were placed in the same group for a project. Sometimes, it wasn't even words. It was the way their backpacks would mysteriously be moved in the hallway, or the way they'd find their lockers slightly open with their notebooks bent and pages crumpled. None of it big enough to point a finger directly, but enough to chip away at a person's confidence day by day. Lisa tried to brush it off. She told Mia to ignore them, that they were just trying to get attention. But the truth was, the feeling of being targeted was inescapable. No matter how they carried themselves, no matter how polite or prepared they were, Ethan and his friends had made up their minds that Lisa and Mia didn't belong. And they made sure to remind them of it constantly. Lunch was the hardest. The cafeteria was a minefield. If they sat at an empty table, it stayed empty. If they sat near anyone else, the conversation would die down. Ethan's group always sat in the center, like kings of a small, cold kingdom. And every so often, his voice would rise just loud enough for everyone to hear, saying something that sounded like a joke but always had a sharp edge to it, aimed right at the girls. The words weren't just playful teasing. They were designed to humiliate, to remind them of their place, as if they were intruding on something that wasn't meant for them. Worse still was the way everyone else stayed silent. Even the students who clearly didn't agree, who glanced at the twins with sympathy now and then, never said anything. Maybe they were afraid of being the next target. Maybe they didn't want to mess up their standing in the social hierarchy. Whatever the reason, their silence spoke volumes. It told Lisa and Mia that they were alone in this fight, and that the people around them would rather pretend not to see than stand up for what was right. Over time, the hostility from Ethan's group grew bolder. One afternoon, as Mia bent down to pick up her bag outside the science lab, someone kicked it across the hallway. She looked up to see Ethan's friend Ryan laughing, with Ethan leaning against the wall watching it all like it was entertainment. Another time, during gym, they accidentally tripped over Lisa during a soccer drill, sending her tumbling hard to the floor. The coach didn't say a word, just told everyone to keep moving. These weren't just jokes anymore. They were coordinated, intentional. A performance designed to make Lisa and Mia feel powerless. And the most painful part was how well it worked. Some days, the twins would walk into school with their chins high and hearts steady. Other days, they'd sit quietly through classes, trying to stay small, trying not to give anyone a reason to notice them. But it didn't matter. The bullying came anyway. At home, they tried to stay strong. They didn't always tell their parents every detail. They didn't want them to worry. But the weight of those days clung to them, making their evenings quieter, heavier. There were nights when Mia stared at the ceiling, wondering why some people chose cruelty over kindness. There were mornings when Lisa had to take a deep breath before stepping onto the school bus, rehearsing in her head all the ways she could stay calm, all the things she could say back if Ethan struck again. Through it all, the sisters never turned against each other. If anything, their bond became stronger. When one felt too tired to smile, the other did it for both of them. When one was pushed too far, the other stepped in. They were more than just sisters. They were each other's shield. And while Ethan and his group did everything in their power to isolate and hurt them, they never managed to break that. The cruelty they faced wasn't just about teenage meanness. It was deeper, rooted in something uglier. It was a reflection of the world outside the school walls, brought into the hallways of Maplewood in whispered insults and public shaming. But Lisa and Mia were not raised to be victims. They felt the pain, yes. They carried the scars. But even as the days grew harder, they held on to something stronger than fear, the belief that they had a right to be there. And that no matter how loud Ethan's voice became, their presence would speak louder. Back home, far from the polished hallways and stiff uniforms of Maplewood Academy, the Johnson household was a place of warmth, resilience, and love. It wasn't fancy or filled with the latest gadgets, but it had everything that mattered. Laughter around the dinner table, long hugs after hard days, and most of all, wisdom passed down through quiet conversations. Their father, Samuel Johnson, was the anchor of that home. A man who had seen enough of the world to know how cruel it could be, but also how beautiful it could become with the right choices. Samuel wasn't the kind of father who raised his voice. He didn't believe in barking rules or forcing strength. Instead, he taught by presence, steady, patient, and always observant. He could tell the moment his daughters walked through the door whether it had been a good day or a tough one. And lately, There had been too many tough ones. He never pushed them to explain. When they were ready to talk, he listened, really listened. Then, instead of just reacting in anger or frustration, he guided. Samuel believed that strength wasn't just about standing your ground in a fight. It was about knowing when to speak and when to walk away, when to protect your peace and when to defend your truth. And that was what he passed on to Lisa and Mia. Not just the ability to defend themselves, but the mindset to do it with integrity. He started with small lessons. On some evenings, after homework and dinner, he'd lead them to the backyard, where they practiced basic self-defense techniques. Not because he wanted them to fight, but because he wanted them to feel safe in their own bodies. He taught them how to block, how to stay aware of their surroundings, how to read energy in a room. But more than that, he taught them how to stay emotionally grounded. Samuel would remind them over and over that their dignity wasn't something anyone could take unless they gave it away. That the most powerful kind of defense wasn't with fists, it was with presence. Standing tall. Speaking clearly. Knowing who you are even when the world tries to define you differently. And that when cruelty came their way, they had the right to protect their spirit as much as their skin. He helped them reframe the way they thought about the bullying. Instead of shrinking in shame, he encouraged them to see it for what it was, a reflection of fear and ignorance in others, not a flaw in themselves. That shift wasn't easy. Lisa struggled with it at first, often replaying Ethan's words in her head long after the school day ended. Mia internalized more of the pain, letting it sit silently on her shoulders. But over time, with Samuel's quiet persistence and their mother's gentle reassurances, the girls began to shift. They started showing up differently. Not louder or more aggressive, but more grounded. When Ethan threw a snide comment their way, they didn't flinch as easily. When his friends laughed at their clothes or mocked their voices, Lisa met their eyes without lowering hers. Mia, who once looked for exits in every hallway, began to walk a little more confidently, her steps more certain. Samuel's approach was never about revenge or even confrontation. He wanted his daughters to move through life with clarity and confidence, not fear. He reminded them that even when others refused to see their worth, their job wasn't to prove anything. It was to remain whole. He also taught them how to handle authority, or, more precisely, how to handle the absence of it. When teachers failed to protect them, when adults turned away, Samuel didn't sugarcoat the injustice. But he also didn't want his daughters to grow up bitter. Instead, he showed them how to advocate for themselves, with facts, composure, and a clear voice. He taught them how to document what happened, how to report it, how to speak up even when they felt no one was listening. Lisa and Mia practiced those conversations at home. They'd take turns pretending to talk to a teacher or counselor, learning how to be firm but respectful, how to name what happened without sounding like they were complaining. Samuel reminded them that their voices were tools, and like any tool, they needed to learn how to use them. On weekends, they'd sit around the kitchen table and talk about the world. Not just school, but history, identity, power. Samuel wove lessons about their ancestors into everyday moments, reminding them that they came from a long line of people who had survived worse and still stood tall. He wanted them to feel that lineage, to know that their strength wasn't just theirs, it was inherited, carried, earned. In those quiet moments, the house became more than just a safe space. It became a training ground, not for war, but for life. For the slow, steady resistance it takes to stay true to yourself when the world tries to wear you down. For the grace it takes to forgive, but the courage it takes to not forget. For the balance of being soft and strong, open-hearted but wise. Lisa and Mia didn't become warriors overnight. But day by day, they grew sturdier inside. And though the bullying at school continued, it no longer felt like a storm they couldn't withstand. Their father had given them something most kids never learn until much later: the ability to protect not just their bodies, but their spirit. The knowledge that they could face hostility and not be defined by it. And perhaps most importantly, the quiet confidence that, together, they were already enough. For most students, school is supposed to be a place of learning, discovery, and maybe even a little fun. A place where you grow into yourself, surrounded by people who guide and support you along the way. But for Lisa and Mia, Maplewood Academy didn't feel like that. It felt like walking through a maze without a map, where every corner turn brought another wall, another silence, another door that refused to open. It wasn't just the students who made them feel like outsiders. It was the quiet indifference of the adults who were supposed to help. That was perhaps the most confusing and painful part. How the people in charge, the ones wearing ties and carrying clipboards and telling students to believe in themselves, somehow never seemed to notice when the twins were hurting. It started subtly. When Lisa and Mia raised their hands to participate in class, their answers were often skipped over or barely acknowledged. When they asked for help with assignments, the explanations were rushed or half-hearted, like the teachers had somewhere else to be. And when they did well, aced a test or presented a project with clarity and confidence, it didn't seem to carry the same weight as when others did. There was no praise, no spotlight. Just a shrug and a turn of the page. It made them question everything. Were they imagining it? Were they overthinking things? But day after day, the pattern continued, and it became impossible to ignore. Then there was the bullying. It wasn't hidden. Ethan and his friends weren't exactly subtle. There were taunts in the hallways, mocking laughter during class transitions, and obvious sabotage of school supplies and lockers. The cafeteria incidents, the gym accidents, the group projects that ended with the twins doing all the work while their peers took credit, none of it was a secret. And yet, the adults remained silent. Teachers turned their heads. Hall monitors walked by. Counselors smiled gently when Lisa or Mia spoke but offered vague encouragement instead of action. There was one day, in particular, that stayed with Mia. She had finally built up the courage to talk to her English teacher, someone she had admired for her passion and warmth. Mia waited after class and explained what had been happening, not with anger, but with quiet, careful words. She spoke about the things that made her uncomfortable, about how she felt excluded, about how Ethan's group made her dread coming to school. The teacher nodded, listened politely, and then said something that landed like a brick in Mia's chest. Maybe they were just being too sensitive. Maybe Ethan and his friends didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was just how kids interacted. That conversation changed something in her. She didn't cry when she got home. She didn't even tell Lisa right away. But something inside her dimmed a little. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about the people who had the power to do something and chose not to. It made the hallway feel colder, the classroom feel less safe. It made her wonder whether anyone truly had her back at this school. Lisa had her own moment like that too. It was during a science lab when one of Ethan's friends, accidentally, spilled a beaker of water across her notes. The teacher saw it happen, clearly saw Lisa's frustration and the smug grin on the boy's face. But instead of addressing it, the teacher just told everyone to clean up and move on. Lisa sat through the rest of class with her pages soggy, trying not to let the sting in her chest show on her face. When she got home, she didn't talk much. Just quietly rewrote all her notes from memory at the kitchen table, her jaw tight, her pen pressed too hard against the page. What made it all worse was the silence of the other students. There were a few who seemed kind, who didn't laugh at the jokes or roll their eyes at the sight of the twins. Some even gave them shy smiles in the hallway. But when it came time to speak up, no one did. Not when Ethan made fun of Mia's voice in front of the class. Not when Lisa's locker was filled with garbage as a prank. Not even when they were clearly left out of group work and forced to do assignments alone. It was like everyone saw what was happening, but nobody wanted to be the one to break the code of silence. Lisa and Mia tried to understand it. Maybe the other kids were afraid. Maybe they didn't want to get pulled into the drama. Maybe they thought staying quiet made them neutral. But to the twins, that silence was louder than any insult. It meant they were on their own. It meant that even kindness, when not backed by courage, wasn't enough to make them feel safe. Still, they didn't stop trying. They kept going to class. They turned in their work on time. They joined clubs even though no one welcomed them warmly. They smiled at teachers who barely looked their way. They tried, again and again, to be a part of the school's rhythm. Not because they were desperate to fit in, but because they refused to be pushed out. That was the strength they carried from home, the kind of strength that stays steady even when the world around you stays quiet. And every evening, when they walked back into their house, they were reminded of who they really were. Their parents greeted them with love, listened when they were ready to speak, and reminded them, without needing to say it, that their worth didn't come from anyone's approval. That even though the school had failed them in many ways, They hadn't failed themselves. They still showed up. They still stood tall. And in a world where silence often wins, that alone was a quiet, powerful kind of victory. The tension had been building for weeks, slow and steady like a storm gathering on the edge of town. Lisa and Mia had done everything right. They kept their heads down, focused on their schoolwork, and tried their best to ignore the taunts, the stares, the whispered jokes that followed them through every hallway. But there's only so much a person can hold inside before something breaks. And for the twins, that moment came during an ordinary Thursday that started like any other, but didn't end that way. It had been a particularly rough morning. Mia had spilled juice on her uniform and had to change last minute, making them late for homeroom. Lisa had forgotten her English homework on the kitchen counter, something that had never happened before. Both of them walked into school already feeling off balance. And when Ethan's group saw them that day, it was as if they could smell the vulnerability. The jokes came faster, harsher. The laughter louder. Even their body language felt more aggressive, blocking doors, whispering and smirking while pointing, sending a message that didn't need to be spoken. We own this space, and you don't. During lunch, the cafeteria was buzzing as usual, but for Lisa and Mia, it felt like walking into a pressure cooker. They sat at their usual spot near the far window, where fewer students gathered, hoping to eat quietly and get through the rest of the day. But Ethan had other plans. He and his group walked past their table slowly, dragging out the moment, and then one of them, Ryan, accidentally knocked over a full cup of soda, spilling it right across Mia's tray and onto her lap. For a moment, the entire cafeteria seemed to freeze. Mia stood there, stunned, her skirt soaked, her lunch ruined. Lisa jumped up with a napkin, trying to help, but her hands were shaking. Ethan laughed under his breath, and someone else clapped mockingly in the background. No teachers stepped in. No one told the boys to stop. The only sounds were quiet giggles and the shuffle of students pretending not to see what had just happened. Mia didn't cry. She clenched her jaw, wiped her skirt, and sat back down. Lisa stayed on her feet, heart pounding, her eyes fixed on Ethan's smirk. Something in her face must have changed because for once, he looked away. That night, the girls didn't talk much. There was no big dramatic breakdown, no ranting about how unfair everything was. Just silence. A quiet decision forming between them. A line had been crossed. Enough was enough. The following week, things escalated. During gym class, the students were running laps around the field. Mia was ahead of most of the group when suddenly, she tripped, hard. She landed face first on the ground, scraping her hands and knees. Behind her, Ethan and two of his friends were laughing. Lisa rushed over, helping her up. But what made Lisa furious wasn't just the fall. It was the fact that Mia had been shoved. She had felt it, seen the slight push from behind. The gym teacher called it an accident and told Mia to walk it off. Later that day, Lisa and Mia went to the counselor's office again. This time, they were calm but direct. They explained everything: the jokes, the harassment, the isolation, the spilled drink, the shove. But even then, the counselor's face stayed neutral, eyes flicking to the clock more than once. She promised to look into it, but the girls left feeling like their words had just been filed away in a drawer that wouldn't be opened. So they waited. Not because they were scared, but because they were smart. They knew acting in anger would only be used against them. They remembered their father's words about timing, about not letting rage dictate the response. They knew that the world wasn't always fair, and if they were going to take a stand, it had to be at the right moment. That moment came 2 days later. It was during a group presentation in history class. Lisa and Mia were paired with Ethan and one of his friends, a decision made by the teacher, who seemed oblivious or indifferent to the history between them. Predictably, Ethan did nothing to help. He mocked their slide choices, refused to rehearse, and then tried to sabotage the actual presentation by, accidentally, flipping the slides out of order on the projector. But this time, the twins were ready. Lisa took a deep breath and calmly corrected the slides. Mia continued the presentation without missing a beat. When Ethan tried to interrupt with a joke, Lisa turned and addressed the class directly, summarizing their section with clarity and strength, exposing his lack of contribution without ever raising her voice. The room went quiet. Even the teacher looked uncomfortable. After class, Ethan confronted them in the hallway. His words were sharp, but his voice was shaky. This wasn't going the way he expected. And when he shoved Mia again, hard enough that her books fell to the floor, Lisa stepped between them. She didn't yell. She didn't push back. She simply looked him in the eye and said everything he had done would be reported. Not just to the school, but beyond. She mentioned evidence. Witnesses. Her voice was steady, calm, but undeniable. By the end of the day, the principal's office was buzzing. The twins had filed a formal complaint, and for the first time, they weren't alone. A few students who had witnessed the shove came forward. Others who had seen the spilled soda incident added their voices. Something had shifted. Maybe it was the courage in Lisa and Mia's voices. Maybe it was the way they refused to be intimidated. Maybe it was just time. But the silence that had once protected Ethan and his group started to crack. The situation didn't resolve overnight. But the school was forced to investigate. Teachers who had ignored things were now answering questions. Ethan and his friends were pulled out of classes. And Lisa and Mia, they didn't gloat. They didn't celebrate. They just kept showing up, quietly, powerfully, knowing that the storm they had weathered had finally reached its breaking point. Their strength wasn't in shouting or fighting back with fists. It was in knowing when to stand still and when to move. When to speak and when to wait. And when the moment came to rise, they did, not as victims, but as young women who had learned that silence only wins when we allow it to. Their patience hadn't been weakness. It had been a preparation for a moment that would change everything. The fight that Lisa and Mia found themselves in wasn't just about dodging cruel comments or avoiding another shove in the hallway. It was deeper than that, quieter but heavier. It was a battle to keep their sense of self intact in a place that tried, every single day, to convince them they didn't belong. And as things reached a boiling point at Maplewood Academy, the real struggle began, not in the classroom or the lunchroom, but within their own hearts. Up until that moment, they had carried themselves with grace. Even when Ethan's group pushed, they hadn't pushed back, not in the way people expected. They didn't scream or throw punches. They showed up. They walked into school with their shoulders back. They studied. They stayed kind. But make no mistake, they were fighting every day. Not with their hands, but with something stronger. With resilience. After the hallway incident, the shove, the confrontation, and the formal complaint, things shifted at school. Students started to talk. Some showed sympathy. A few even apologized for not saying anything earlier. Teachers were more alert. The administration launched an investigation. But what most people didn't see was what happened inside Lisa and Mia after all that. They had taken a risk by standing up so publicly. There were days when they wondered if it would be worth it. They worried the school would sweep things under the rug, that nothing would change, and they'd be left more isolated than ever. But instead of letting those fears take over, they leaned into everything their father had taught them. They leaned into each other. They began walking through the halls differently. It wasn't pride, exactly, it was clarity. Lisa's voice grew steadier in class. Mia started asking more questions, even challenging ideas during discussions. They no longer shrank when Ethan passed by. They didn't need to. The power he once held, the control he had through fear, silence, and the loyalty of those around him, was crumbling. And it wasn't because Lisa and Mia had won, in the traditional sense. It was because they had refused to break. The school still had its problems. Not every teacher suddenly became an advocate. Not every student transformed into an ally. But the environment felt different. And that was partly because Lisa and Mia carried themselves differently. They weren't waiting for permission to exist anymore. They weren't hoping to be accepted. They were showing up exactly as they were, smart, strong, kind, and unafraid to take up space. At home, their parents noticed the change too. Samuel, their father, would watch them come in after school, tired but lighter. He didn't always say something, but he didn't have to. He could see it in their posture, their energy. The quiet confidence that comes after you've walked through fire and realized you're still standing. Their mother would sometimes brush a hand across their backs as they passed by, like a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured, everything they had overcome. Lisa took up journaling more seriously. Writing became her way to sort through the mess of emotions. On the outside, she looked calm, composed. But inside, she was still navigating the emotional scars of the months of mistreatment. She poured everything into her notebook: frustrations, victories, reflections. It helped her process things in a way words couldn't always express aloud. Mia, on the other hand, took comfort in movement. She began running in the mornings before school, early, when the streets were quiet and the sky still soft with dawn. It helped her clear her head, ground herself, and face each day with a bit more strength. They were healing, not all at once, but bit by bit. And they knew that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened. It meant carrying the lessons with them, using them to grow stronger without growing bitter. That was the power of their inner fight. They didn't just survive the bullying, they transformed through it. One afternoon, a new girl started at Maplewood. Her name was Trinity, and like Lisa and Mia, she was one of the only black students in the school. Lisa spotted her in the cafeteria, standing awkwardly with a tray, unsure where to sit. Without hesitation, she waved her over. Mia scooted to the side to make room. That small gesture said everything. It said, "We see you. You're not alone." That moment wasn't just kindness, it was leadership. It was the beginning of something bigger than just their own story. The more they stepped into who they were, the more others began to follow. They started organizing small group meetups for students who felt out of place, safe spaces where people could talk openly, be heard, be real. What started as an effort to survive had grown into something greater. They were building community. Not loud, not flashy, just consistent, steady, honest. By spring, the school year was winding down, and while the wounds of the past hadn't vanished, they had become part of a much bigger picture. Lisa and Mia had gone from being the targets of cruelty to becoming quiet forces of change. And they had done it not by overpowering their bullies, but by refusing to let those bullies define them. Their strength didn't come from fighting back in the way most people think of a fight. It came from choosing who they would be every single day, despite the pressure to be something else. It came from staying soft in a hard world. From speaking up even when no one else did. From showing other students, and maybe even some teachers, what real courage looks like. Because in the end, the fight at Maplewood wasn't just about Ethan or the jokes or the spilled drinks. It was about the right to belong. The right to be seen without needing to prove yourself every second. The right to feel safe, to learn, to grow, just like everyone else. Lisa and Mia claimed that right, not by demanding it, but by living it. And that quiet, unshakable strength? That was their victory. As the semester moved toward its final stretch, the mood at Maplewood Academy began to shift. What had once been whispers in the hallways and quiet glances now turned into open conversations. The silence that had protected Ethan and his group for so long was no longer a shield. Word had gotten around about what happened, about the complaint Lisa and Mia filed, about the students who came forward, and about the school's decision to finally investigate. And when the truth began to surface, so did the consequences. At first, Ethan tried to act like nothing had changed. He still walked the halls with his usual swagger, still laughed too loudly in class, still made snide comments when he thought teachers weren't listening. But there was a difference now. The laughter wasn't as loud. His friends weren't as eager to follow his lead. And the teachers, they were watching. It started with small things. Ethan was pulled from class more often, meeting with administrators behind closed doors. Ryan and a few others in his group were asked to stay after school for private discussions. Students who had once turned a blind eye were being asked to submit written statements about what they had seen. Even the teachers who had once ignored the tension seemed more cautious, like they were finally realizing how serious things had gotten. Then came the official hearing. Lisa and Mia were given the option to attend or provide a written testimony. They chose the latter, not out of fear, but because they had already spoken their truth. They didn't need to sit in a room and rehash every painful moment. Their words were on paper, clear, composed, and backed by facts. Witnesses had stepped forward. Security camera footage was reviewed. The school couldn't deny what had happened any longer. The findings were difficult to ignore. Ethan, Ryan, and 2 other students had repeatedly targeted Lisa and Mia over the course of several months. Their behavior included verbal harassment, physical intimidation, and deliberate exclusion. The administration had no choice. They issued suspensions, followed by permanent removal from key school activities, sports teams, student council, academic clubs. For Ethan, it went further. After an additional review, his actions were deemed severe enough to merit expulsion. He would not be returning the following year. At home, Lisa and Mia didn't celebrate. They didn't throw around words like justice or revenge. But there was a quiet relief, a soft exhale that had been building for months. Their father, Samuel, nodded when he heard the news. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "That's what happens when the truth stands tall long enough." And the girls knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. About finally being seen. Ethan's parents appealed the decision. They claimed the school was being too harsh, that boys would be boys, that it was all a misunderstanding. But by then, the damage was already done. The school had to protect its reputation, yes, but more importantly, it had to protect its students. For too long, it had failed to do that. Now, it was trying to make things right. The ripple effects extended beyond Ethan's group. Students who had once joined in on the teasing now kept their distance. Some apologized. Others simply avoided eye contact. But for the first time, Lisa and Mia felt the weight begin to lift. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to breathe easier. There was also a broader impact on the school community. Teachers attended new training sessions focused on recognizing bias and preventing harassment. The administration set up a student-led diversity committee, and Lisa and Mia were invited to be part of it. At first, they hesitated. They didn't want to be used as a symbol or a checkbox. But after talking it through, they realized they could shape the space into something real, something that might actually make a difference for future students like them. And they did. They helped draft a new anti-bullying policy, one that included not just punishment but also education and support for both victims and perpetrators. They created a monthly forum where students could speak freely, anonymously if needed. They started organizing community-building events, movie nights, cultural showcases, student panels, that made the school feel just a little more connected. Lisa began mentoring a younger student who was having trouble adjusting to Maplewood. Mia took on a leadership role in the school newspaper, writing a piece that didn't name names but told the story in a way that touched everyone who read it. Their presence, once ignored, once doubted, was now something people looked to, not just because of what they endured, but because of how they carried themselves through it. As for Ethan, no one really knew where he went after being expelled. There were rumors, another school, some kind of probation program, maybe even therapy. But Lisa and Mia didn't care to follow up. They weren't interested in seeing him fall. That was never the point. The point was that they stood their ground, told their truth, and helped push the school to become better. That was enough. In time, Maplewood Academy did begin to look different. It wasn't perfect. No school is. But there was a new awareness in the air. A sense that things could change, that silence wasn't always the default, that students didn't have to fight alone. Lisa and Mia had started something, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen. And even though their days at Maplewood would eventually come to an end, their impact wouldn't. The policies they helped shape, the conversations they sparked, the courage they modeled, it would all remain, woven into the walls of the school they once feared walking into. They had left a mark, not with noise or drama, but with strength and truth. And that kind of mark doesn't fade. By the end of the school year, something had changed, not just around Lisa and Mia, but within them. The same halls that once felt hostile and narrow now felt wider, as if the air inside had shifted just enough to let in something new: respect. It didn't come from winning awards or popularity contests. It came from showing up, day after day, with strength and self-respect, even when everything around them made it hard to do so. In a place where they were once made to feel small, they had taken up space, not loudly but steadily, and made it clear that they deserved to be there. Their story wasn't just about what they had endured. It was about what they chose to do with it. When the bullying started, they could have crumbled, could have lashed out, could have given up. But instead, they chose patience. They chose purpose. And over time, their quiet strength turned into a kind of leadership. Not the kind that asks for attention, but the kind that inspires others to stand a little taller, speak a little clearer, and care a little more. Teachers began to see them differently. Not just as students, but as change-makers. The same staff who once dismissed their concerns now stopped to listen. Some even asked for their input on how to make classrooms more inclusive. Students who had once stayed silent during the bullying now spoke up when they saw something wrong. And the ones who once followed Ethan's lead either kept their distance or, in some cases, asked for a second chance. Lisa and Mia didn't offer bitterness. They didn't forget, but they didn't hold on to resentment either. They understood that people grow. And sometimes, being part of change means letting others grow, too. What they didn't expect, though, was how many younger students looked up to them. A few started leaving notes in their lockers. Simple things like, "Thank you for speaking up," or "You helped me feel brave today." Others started sitting closer in the cafeteria or asking for advice. It was clear that their story had traveled beyond just whispers and headlines. It had planted something in the hearts of those who had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of how to speak their own truth. Lisa and Mia weren't trying to be role models. They were just trying to make it through the year with their dignity intact. But in doing so, they became something much more powerful, a symbol of what it means to face injustice with grace, to respond to cruelty without losing kindness, and to walk through adversity with your head held high. Their family, too, felt the shift. Samuel and their mother watched with quiet pride as their daughters stepped more confidently into themselves. They had always believed in their strength, but now the world could see it too. And that mattered. Not because the world's approval defined them, but because being seen, truly seen, helped others understand that their experiences were real, valid, and worthy of respect. As the final weeks of school passed, there were moments of reflection. The pain, the isolation, the endless days of pushing through, it hadn't disappeared. But it had transformed. What once felt like a heavy shadow now felt like a foundation. Something they could stand on. Something that reminded them of who they were and what they had overcome. And in that transformation, they found peace. The closing assembly was held in the auditorium, filled with laughter, music, and speeches. Lisa and Mia sat near the back, content just to witness it all. But near the end, something unexpected happened. The school principal took the stage and, without naming names or going into detail, acknowledged that the year had brought challenges, and that some students had shown extraordinary resilience in the face of them. He spoke of courage, of justice, of the importance of standing up when it's easier to stay silent. And though he never said their names, Lisa and Mia knew. The subtle nods from their teachers, the quiet glances from classmates, it was all there. It was enough. As they walked out of the auditorium that day, they didn't feel victorious in the way stories often describe. There was no dramatic ending, no grand applause. Just the soft, sure feeling that they had done something hard, and done it well. That they had earned their place, not by fighting to be accepted, but by refusing to be erased. They had learned something that year that would stay with them forever. That justice doesn't always come fast, and it doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a quiet seat at the table, earned through persistence. Sometimes it comes through the respect in someone's eyes when they realize they were wrong. And sometimes, it comes simply in knowing you didn't give up. Lisa and Mia didn't just survive Maplewood Academy. They transformed it. Not all at once, and not completely, but enough to leave a mark. Enough to remind the school that kindness must be protected, that silence must be challenged, and that the voices of those most often ignored can be the ones that lead the way. And as they closed the chapter on that school year, they carried forward something stronger than any medal or certificate. They carried forward the quiet, powerful truth that resilience is its own kind of victory, and that when you stand for what's right, even in the face of resistance, you never truly stand alone. Life doesn't always unfold in fair and gentle ways. Sometimes, like Lisa and Mia, we find ourselves in environments where we're judged before we're understood, tested before we're welcomed, and challenged more deeply than we ever expected. But what their journey reminds us, especially those of us who have seen more of life, is that strength doesn't always roar. True resilience is often quiet. It's the ability to show up every day with integrity, even when the world doesn't meet you with kindness. It's choosing dignity over revenge, clarity over chaos, and purpose over pain. We're never too old to remember this. Our silence in the face of injustice doesn't keep us safe, it keeps us stuck. But when we use our voice with grace, when we advocate not just for ourselves but for those who follow, we help create a world that's just a little fairer, a little warmer, a little more human. So whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, or simply someone trying to do what's right, you matter. Your courage matters. And your example has the power to ripple far beyond what you can see. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What kind of real-life stories or topics would you like us to explore next? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming reflections on courage, kindness, and the quiet power of doing what's right. Let's keep growing together.